This is the fourth module in the 5-module Research and Developmental Psychology lecture. And what we're going to work on now, if you remember in the previous module, the experimental method and correlational method were presented as two ways of conducting research. There are three other ways that are utilized most often by developmental psychologists that help them discover changes over time. These ways include longitudinal design, cross-sectional design, and cross-sequential designs. So let's go ahead and start looking at these wonderful designs that developmental psychologists utilize. The first thing that we need to talk about when we think about studying things over time is what can be impacting those results. And the first thing that can impact the results are age effects, or the effects of just simply getting older. There are also cohort effects, and these are effects of being born in a particular historical context. So, say, people who were all born around the Great Depression are going to have a very different growing up experience than people who were born in the 1990s during a time of economic prosperity. So when we talk about a cohort, we're talking about a group of people born at the same time, either in the same year or within a specified span of years. So everybody that was in your third grade class was a cohort of yours. And then there's the time of measurement effects. These are the effects of historical events and trends occurring when the data is collected. So, example, if in the middle of the study there's a huge economic downturn and people lose jobs, and then eventually it recovers several years later, that's going to have a real influence on the experiences of the people growing up during that time. Or let's say there was some world war. This also would have a impact on the overall development. So we're going to try to avoid these sorts of impacts, but keep in mind these three different types of effects, because those are ones that some have advantage. Some of the research designs have advantages with some of these effects, and some of these effects have a negative impact on these designs. The first design we're going to talk about is cross-sectional design. And the cross-sectional design is the performance of different age groups or cohorts that are compared. Now this is really nice because it's quick and easy, and it's likely to yield valid conclusions of similar growing up experiences. For example, I don't have a lot of money and I don't have a lot of time, but I'm interested in finding out how reading skills change from first grade through sixth grade. Rather than take first graders and have to wait 6 whole years before I find out how their reading skills change, I could go ahead and take a cross-section. So take different age groups like first, third, fifth, and sixth graders, and then compare them and how they differ in their reading skills. That way I can do it really quick in a single day, and I should have fairly valid conclusions as long as the curriculum and things are the same for the sixth graders as they were for the first graders as they were going through school. Now, the limitations of this particular approach is that there are age effects and cohort effects that confound or entangle the results. In other words, the experience of getting older may have changed during that time frame that I measured. That what sixth graders were going through in first grade is not the world that the first graders are going through. This was really evident, say, if this study took place in the mid-1990s. First graders at that time may not have access to any types of computers, whereas 5 years later, where you're almost into 2000, those first graders have access to computers all over. And so that would be an age and cohort effect. So that's one of the problems with the cross-sectional design, and yet it's still used fairly frequently because it is quick and easy and does yield pretty valid results most of the time. And you'll see this in your assignments. The second design is a longitudinal design. Now, the longitudinal design shows the performance of one cohort of individuals which is assessed repeatedly over time. So in the example of the reading scores, this would be when you do take first graders and follow them for 6 years. The advantage of this is that you reveal individual changes over time. So you can say how these children grow up and individually change. The limitation is, once again, age effects and cohort effects are confounded or entangled. Even though what you find is very true for that particular cohort, you want to have research results that are able to generalize way beyond just a single cohort into a more universal type of development. Other disadvantages is that this can be a costly and time-consuming process. Measurement methods can become outdated. So, for example, if you decided to do a study and wanted to do it over 30 years, the questions that you asked at the beginning may not be valid 30 years later. Participants oftentimes drop out of long-term studies because they either move away, they get tired of participating, and so you also have to worry about the effects of repeatedly testing and using the same measure again and again, because eventually people will get better at them, or they will maybe not answer as an honest fashion. So the longitudinal design is very valuable. You see these in some of the health studies out there, the Framingham Heart Project, for instance, and there's also a nurse longitudinal study, nurses' health longitudinal study. But all those are very, very helpful in having knowledge on how we age and how our skills change as we age. But they are very difficult to do. So you don't see these too often, but there are some of those studies in your assignment. The last of the designs we're going to talk about is the sequential design, or cross-sequential design as sometimes you see it. And what the cross-sequential design does is combine the cross-sectional approach and the longitudinal approach into a single study. And for example, what this would look like is if I was doing my 1st through 6th grade study, I would examine 1st graders, 3rd graders, and 5th graders, except I would examine it over a 2-year period, or a 3-year period. The 1st graders I would study in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade. The 3rd graders I'd study in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And the 5th graders I'd study in 5th, 6th, and 7th grades. And there's going to be overlap. So where I started with 3rd graders, the 1st graders at the end of this approach will go ahead and be measured at the same point in time. Why we would do this is that it helps address the issues regarding age effects, cohort effects, and time of measurement effects, which we discussed with cross-sectional and longitudinal designs being kind of their limitations. The limitation of the cross-sequential design is that it is extremely complex and expensive, and at the end of it all, it may not be always able to provide a definitive answer. And if your head was starting to hurt a little bit when I was describing the sequential design approach, that's because it was complex. And I wouldn't even pretend how to run one necessarily, especially with the data analysis. But like I said, you will run across some of those in your assignments, and this is very important to kind of know what they are. And the reason it is nice to know all of these different designs that developmental psychologists use is because this is the backbone of all these facts and statistics that I spit out to you on lecture. So it's important to know kind of where all of that comes from. So let's do a little bit of a review of what we did today in this module. The longitudinal design is one of those designs where you look at people from the beginning to the end of a research period. This is usually a more lengthy period. Now, cross-sectional design is very quick and dirty because you can go ahead and assess different cohorts all at the same time. So you measure 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 6th graders all at the same time to come up to some general conclusion of how they change over time. Then we have the cross-sequential design, the very complex design that combines elements from the longitudinal and cross-sectional designs into its own. We also focused on age and cohort effects, which are severe limitations, especially when using longitudinal and cross-sectional designs. Next, in the final module of this lecture, we're going to have an overview of attachment. We're going to use attachment because it is a very important issue in developmental psychology, and it also is the common thread in all the studies in your assignment.